In our study in the book of Genesis, we've seen that the book deals with 4 great events and 4 great people. First came the 4 great events: creation, the formation of the universe, earth, all life, including humanity. Then there was the fall, humanity's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, introducing sin and death and brokenness into the world. That later led to the flood, God's judgment through a global flood that preserved Noah and his family as a new beginning after the flood. Then there was the Tower of Babel, humanity's attempt to unify and elevate themselves, leading to God's intervention by confusing their languages and dispersing the nations. That's the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis. But from chapters 12 through 50, the bulk of Genesis deals with 4 great people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Joseph, who is given about 25% of the entire book of Genesis. 1/4 of the literary real estate is devoted to Joseph. So we're dealing with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel, of which Joseph is the one who preserves the family in Egypt, setting the nation of Israel up for a return to the promised land 430 years later. Now, in the previous chapter, in verse 28, it says Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. And when Jacob moved his entire family down to Egypt, he was 130 years old. When he met Pharaoh, he said, I'm not really that old. He says, few have been the days of my pilgrimage. I'm 130 years old. But if you compare him to his great-grandfather, Terah, who lived to be 205, or his grandfather Abraham, who lived to be 175, or his father Isaac, who lived to be 180, in comparison, 130 years wasn't that old. It was definitely fewer. But now, 17 years later, he's an old man. And here in chapter 48, we discover that he's sick. He's on his deathbed. Chapters 48 and 49 form the deathbed scene of Jacob at 147 years old. But throughout the generations and the passing down of the covenant, we see Jacob passing on a legacy to his family. And for us, God, his promises, they're not just for us. They're meant to be handed down and passed on to our children, to our families, our friends, and disciples, those who are spiritual children or spiritual heirs in our lives. We're to pass on what we have received and equip others to walk in God's promises with greater clarity, greater courage, and greater commitment than even we have. So with that, we see first the passing on of the inheritance beginning in verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, "Indeed, your father is sick." And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, "Look, your son Joseph is coming to you." And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Notice in verse 2, both of his names are used. Jacob, his birth name, and then the name God gave him, Israel. Now, chapter 47, it ended with Jacob bowing down on the head of his bed. His death was drawing near, but he would not die before he prophetically blessed his sons, beginning with his grandsons here through Joseph. So when Joseph heard the news that his father was sick, he came to his father and he brought his 2 sons, Manasseh, the firstborn, and Ephraim, the secondborn. And when Joseph arrives, Jacob's told, "Hey, your son is here," and that gives him just enough of a burst of energy to prop himself up. Verse 3, then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession.'" Now, if you recall, Luz got its name changed to Bethel, that meaning the house of God. It was called Luz, but because Jacob saw this vision of God in his dreams, of the angels descending and ascending up and down the staircase, he woke up the next day and said, "God is in this place and I didn't know it. I'm calling this the house of God, Bethel. And that's what he's referring to. God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. Notice Jacob is focusing on the blessings of God. For so long, we've read about his moaning and complaining. He complained to Laban. He was complaining to his sons, on and on. He was complaining about his situation. And now finally, God is in his life. God is in his thoughts. And the blessings in his life are attributed to God. Here, after 147 years, he finally learns to focus on the Lord, to see things from God's perspective, and to notice his many blessings. That means there's hope for all of us. Only God can teach an old dog new tricks. And God can teach old dogs new tricks. And after all that has been cemented into the character of Jacob, all of his negativity and manipulation, here he is attributing the blessings to God. So he strengthens himself. He sat up on his bed and he tells Joseph what God had promised him there in verse 4. Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. And the way that Jacob phrased this was very similar to the exact promise that God made to Abraham back in chapter 17. That indicates that when God spoke these covenant promises to Abraham, his grandfather, Abraham was very careful to pass down the exact words of that covenant to Isaac, and Isaac passed down the wording of it to Jacob, and Jacob is now passing down the wording of it to Joseph and to his sons. Why? Because the exact words of God are important. So it wasn't up to Jacob just to bring the ideas of God, and that is significant, but even more so, the exact words, the phrasing of God as well. The words of God are important. And he says, he gave me a promise. And the promise had three parts. First, the promise of a people that would be his own family. It says that I will make you fruitful and multiply you. And Jacob had a large family. It went from himself to he got married, and we know he got a few wives, and then having 12 sons and some daughters, and eventually 70 people in his family are now living in Egypt. His family has grown. That is part of the promise. But the second part of the promise isn't just a people, but a population. I will make you a multitude of people. It's an entire nation. I'll bless your descendants and make you a great nation, just like he told Abraham. And that promise came to pass. 70 people will eventually become 2.1 million people by conservative estimates by the time of the Exodus when they leave the land of Egypt. They will grow immensely in the land of Goshen. Now, the third part of the promise is for a place. So a people, a population, and a place, a land, the land. Notice it says, I will give you this land. And he's in Luz when he's received this promise. I will give you this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Now, obviously, there's huge debate that's been going on for 2,000 years. And because it's not only historic but prophetic, it is being debated and protested here in the United States today, as well as in the Middle East. The question is, who does this land belong to? Israel or Palestine? Who should occupy it? Whose land is it? And we could go to recent history and say, well, in 1948, it was the United Nations ruling that created the modern state of Israel, allowing the Jewish people to reoccupy it and to move from all over the world into that land, the land of Israel. And thus it was called Israel, not Palestine. But who oversaw this territory before Israel got it in 1948? After World War I, Britain governed the region under the League of Nations mandate. Now, the Palestinians will say, well, the Palestinians did. But understand, Palestine has never existed as a fully sovereign, independent nation state with defined borders and a universally recognized national government. There's never been a nation of Palestine. The name Palestine was given by the Romans in the 2nd century as a derivative of Philistines. but not as the name of a nation state. So that name stuck for that particular area, but there's never been a nation of Palestine. But let's keep going back. Before the modern Palestinians occupied it, the Ottoman Empire occupied it, the Turks. So we could say, well, it belongs to Turkey. They had it actually the longest continuous amount of time. But before the Ottoman Turks, the Mamluks, a military caste, controlled it and ruled it from Egypt. And before the Mamluks, the Crusaders occupied that territory. European Christians captured Jerusalem in the First Crusade. But keep going back. Before the Crusaders, there was the early Muslim rule that took place when different Arab caliphates controlled it. And before those tribes, well, it was the Romans. That's who ruled it during the time of Jesus. But before the Romans was the Greeks. And before the Greeks, the Jewish people had it. But before the Jews had it, the Babylonians. And before the Babylonians, the Jews had it again. And before the Jews had it, the Assyrians had it. And you keep going back and back and back. And, well, you have to say it belonged to the Canaanites, the land of Canaan. But now we have another problem. There are no more Canaanites. They're not in existence. So in trying to solve the dilemma of whose land it is, do we say, well, whoever fought and won it in war, is it their land, or whoever has the most money, whoever has the most firepower, or the most need, or the most population? How do we solve this difficulty? We solve it biblically. And I'm going to give you some facts biblically about the land. Fact number one, the land belongs to God. It's God's land. We rightly call it the Holy Land, because the Lord said in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. He says, you're just travelers. You're just passing through. So that's the first fact. The land belongs to God. Fact number two, it was promised to Abraham and his descendants, as we saw in chapter 12. Genesis 12, verse 2, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. And then in verse 7, to your descendants I will give this land, referring to the land of Canaan. So it's God's land, but he's going to give it to Abraham. It's promised to Abraham. Fact number three, the land was a gift, an unconditional gift in perpetuity. Genesis 17, verse 8. God speaking, I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. He's saying, Abraham, it belongs to you and your descendants forever. But Abraham had more than one descendant. He didn't have just Isaac, he had Ishmael. So that brings up fact number four. God promised the land to Isaac and his descendants, not to Ishmael and his descendants. If you recall back in chapter 17, after Ishmael was born, God was going to bless Abraham with another son besides Ishmael. God said, you're going to have another son, and I'm going to bless him, and I'm going to give him the land. Abraham didn't like that idea. He said, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Just fulfill your promise through Ishmael. I know it was through Hagar, the Egyptian servant, the handmaid, but just let it happen through Ishmael. And God said, no, your wife Sarah will have a son, and you will call his name Isaac. I'm going to bless him, and I'm going to give him the land as an everlasting possession. God narrows it. He says, it's mine. I'm going to give it I promised to give it to Abraham and his descendants. Now I'm going to give it not to Ishmael, but to Isaac and his descendants. Fact number five, the land was given not just to Isaac and his descendants, but to Jacob and his descendants, not to Esau. Esau was not given this land. God said, I will bless him. I will give him some other lands, but not this land. And what does Jacob say that God told him there in verse 4 here in Genesis 48? Give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. That points us back to fact number 3. Again, this is an unconditional gift in perpetuity. The biblical mandate is for Israel to occupy that land. Of course, not everyone agrees with the biblical mandate. They want a UN mandate or whatever it might be. And some of the nations around Israel today, Well, they've been trying to get Israel out of this land ever since she got in. She got in 1948. This is the third time you could say that Israel got back into their land. But in 1948, the very next day, a war was declared and Israel was attacked by neighboring nations. They didn't have an army. They were just a bunch of farmers who just got into the land and they were attacked. And ever since Israel got in the land, the Muslim nations, the 300 million neighbors around it, have wanted her out because they think that a Jewish state in the middle of the Muslim part of the world is an anathema. They say we have to expunge the Middle East of any Jewish presence. And now we have people all over the world, including our own college campuses, shouting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Meaning, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, what do they mean by Palestine will be free? I think there are people here on our college campuses that thinks that just means, well, they should have peace and equality for the Palestinian people. That may be in the minds of many. But the phrase itself means destruction and annihilation for Israel. That's what Hamas means by it. That's what many of the other people in the Middle East mean by it. In fact, we have a picture here of Hamas. Understand that Hamas, along with Hezbollah and the Houthis, are all funded by Iran, who has long stated that their goal was to wipe Israel off the map. That's their foreign policy, wipe Israel off the map. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has frequently referred to Israel as a cancerous tumor that must be removed. And though Hamas is Sunni Muslim and Iran is Shiite, so they're at odds within the Muslim world, but Iran supports Hamas due to their shared hostility toward Israel. So the problem persists as Iran has threatened to annihilate Israel because, in their minds, it's the will of Allah to annihilate little Satan, who they say is Israel, and also the great Satan, which is us, the United States. And the world watches on as Iran builds up their nuclear capabilities to destroy Israel. So this has been going on for thousands of years. This goes way, way back. And at this point, especially for us who are believers in the Bible and know the track record of God and His power, we'd much rather believe the promises of God than we do even the nuclear capabilities of the nation of Iran or any neighbor of Israel. In fact, God even promised in the Old Testament in Zechariah chapter 14 that all the nations of the world will come against Jerusalem to come against Israel, but that God would still protect Israel, even when all the nations gather around her. Given just that information, do you think it's possible that in our lifetime to see the nations of the earth coming against Israel? It's pretty easy to see these days. And some will say, well, but the U.S. will always back Israel. It depends on who's president. It depends on the administration. But understand, God gave this land to Israel, the descendants of Jacob. And though they have yet to fully occupy all of the land of Canaan, all the land God gave them, they will in the millennial kingdom, which is another topic, but they will at some point. Here's another thing I need to say. The church is not Israel. Christians who try to replace Israel with the church make a grave error on this topic, and they completely misunderstand Romans 9, 10, and 11. Again, the land of Canaan was given as an unconditional gift in perpetuity. This is God's land and His people. Now, here's another aspect. We understand the people of Israel, they don't know the Lord by and large. They're not Christians. They don't know the Lord, but they will. That's what the Great Tribulation is all about. There will be a time where many come to repentance and come to know the Lord. So we don't acknowledge everything Israel does politically or militarily and say, no, we're casual observers who know biblical prophecy and how this will all unfold. I love Dr. Andy Woods. He's the pastor of Sugar Land Bible Church. He came up with his own phrase, From the river to the sea, the land of Israel will always be. I love that. So I bring all this up so that you know that the times we're living in are not far removed from back then. It's a similar situation. That same promise and that lineage and continuation of fulfillment, we're seeing it dynamically happen around us. So we are living in biblical times, if you didn't know that. Let's move on. Verse 5. And now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon. They shall be mine. Your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. Jacob basically announces to Joseph, I'm going to adopt your sons as my own. They're going to be as Reuben and Simeon. They shall be mine. So not only did he adopt them, but he adopted them at the highest level, as if they were his own firstborn and secondborn, because Reuben and Simeon were the firstborn and secondborn sons of Israel. And remember, these two sons of Joseph had an Egyptian pagan mom whose father was a pagan priest. Yet they were both adopted by Israel. And we can say that our adoption as sons and daughters, as heirs of Christ, is just like theirs. When we are adopted into God's family, we are just as much a son and daughter as the firstborn or the secondborn. We've been adopted into God's family if you've trusted Christ for salvation. But notice how Jacob changes the order. Joseph brought in Manasseh and Ephraim in their birth order. But Jacob refers to them as Ephraim and Manasseh. Keep that in mind, as we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, with Jacob adopting Manasseh and Ephraim as his own, doesn't that make, now we have 13 tribes? Yeah, we do. There were 12 born to Jacob, but Joseph was divided into two separate tribes. So technically, now we have 13. And this gives us a fascinating phenomenon throughout the Old Testament and in some sense in the New Testament. As the tribes of Israel are listed throughout the Old Testament, they can be arranged in different ways and remain a group of 12. In fact, there are more than 20 different ways of listing the tribes in the Old Testament. Just to give you an example, sometimes the tribe of Levi is excluded because they were the priesthood. And because Levi became the priestly tribe, they were not given a land allotment whatsoever, just certain cities in all of the other tribes that they would go to. For God said, I will be your inheritance. I will be your portion. You don't have to worry about land. You'll be taken care of. You officiate in the priesthood. So that puts the land allotment at 12 tribes. Also, Levi would be exempt from when the nations would go to war. So you won't see them listed in any of the battles or going into war. In other lists, Levi is included, but another tribe gets excluded for various reasons. There was always flexibility in the way that God wanted to present the tribes and keep the idea of the 12 tribes. Understand, the number 12 is important to God. We could do a whole study on that another time, but just know, and we've seen already, 12 is an important number to God. Now, there's only one time that Joseph is ever mentioned as the tribe of Joseph, and that's in the New Testament in Revelation chapter 7. That's the only time. In every other list, it's the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh as separate tribes. So Joseph, he gets two shares. And Jacob continues, verse 7, but as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. I think this verse gives us an indication as to why. Jacob has this lingering grief over the tragic death of his beloved wife, Rachel, at the birth of their son, Benjamin. Rachel was Joseph's and Benjamin's mother. She was the wife he loved. She was the woman he loved. And Jacob replaces the sorrow of Rachel's loss with the joy of blessing and adopting her grandsons, thus giving 3 tribes of Israel are through Rachel. So he's expanding her inheritance that way. So we see the passing on of the inheritance now going to these grandsons, but now the passing on of the blessing, continuing on verse 8. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me in this place." And he said, "Please bring them to me, and I will bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring." So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. Now, Manasseh and Ephraim were likely, at this point, they're in their late teens. They're 18 to 20 years old. Old enough to understand the significance of Jacob's blessing, but still considered young enough that they're young men, that they're under Joseph's leadership. And this phrase, "from the knee," it doesn't mean that they're young boys, but it's connected to legal adoption. It's a phrase connected to that. It's an ancient cultural image to becoming heirs. But this is a touching scene. Joseph presents his sons before Jacob, and this isn't the first time or the only time that Jacob has met his grandsons, but this is a special occasion. Jacob is very aware that his death is near, and he needs to settle things. He needs to pronounce a blessing, first upon these two sons of Joseph, but then in chapter 49, he's going to bestow a blessing upon each of his other 12 sons. And so Joseph brings his two sons before Jacob, and notice in verse 12, Joseph bowed down with his face to the earth. Joseph, he's a high-ranking official, second only to Pharaoh, yet none of that diminished his respect for his father. Even though he was a great man in the estimation of the world, he honored his father. He bowed down with his face to the earth before Jacob. Verse 13, and Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Jacob can't see very well, so Joseph positions his sons so that all that Jacob has to do is to reach out his hand straight out and place the right hand on the firstborn, Manasseh, his left hand on Ephraim. The right hand has the idea of a favored position in the Bible, because the right hand is generally the hand of strength and skill for the majority of people. I think 90% of the people are right-handed. So the right hand is associated with God's strength and favor. And Joseph deliberately positions his son so Jacob could just reach straight out and bless his sons appropriately, with the greater blessing going towards the older son with the right hand. Verse 14, then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So Jacob does this. He crosses his hands over so his right hand is on the secondborn, Ephraim, and his left hand on the firstborn, Manasseh. And he does this knowingly. I believe led by the Spirit. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, Israel understood God wanted to give the greater blessing to Ephraim. So he crosses his hands over, he places his right hand on the younger son, intending to grant a greater blessing to Ephraim. This is totally against their normal custom and expectation. These are very regimented societies where it was just understood that the firstborn had the rights and the greater privilege. They had the greater exaltation and a double portion. That's what came with the birthright. This is just the way it was. But God always reserves the right to say, I'm going to do things differently than the way the world does it. And God has complete authority to do such things. That is his sovereign right as God. And in Scripture, we see this happen quite a bit. It wasn't Cain. It was Abel, who later became Shem, who was blessed. It wasn't Ishmael. It was Isaac, who was chosen and blessed. It wasn't Esau. It was Jacob. It wasn't Reuben, the firstborn. It would be Judah, be the messianic line, the fourthborn. But here it's Joseph who received the blessing of the robe signifying that he was prominent even way back when he was 17 years old. And it won't be Aaron, the firstborn. It will be Moses who would lead the nation and be the deliverer of Israel. So God does this a lot. Well, and now comes the blessing. He's going to give the blessing, verse 15. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Israel grants this blessing in deep awareness of the covenant that came from God's promise to his grandfather Abraham and to his father Isaac. And in the midst of that, he blessed Joseph. Jacob's hands are on Joseph's sons, but verse 15 says he blessed Joseph. What's that about? Because in blessing Joseph's sons, it could rightly be said, Israel blessed their father, Joseph. Charles Spurgeon put it this way: no choicer favor could fall upon ourselves than to see our children favored of the Lord. Joseph is doubly blessed by seeing Ephraim and Manasseh blessed. You know, sometimes the greatest thing you can do for a parent is to bless the children. As a father, as a parent, you know, we have no greater joy than to see our children blessed in the Lord and to see God bless their lives and to do a great work. That's exactly what Jacob did in this situation. I also find it interesting that in the words that he spoke, Israel gave the same blessing to both sons. They both got the same blessing, but the son of the right hand, Ephraim, got the greater portion of the blessing. So the same words were spoken to both, but the son of the right hand would receive a greater blessing. This was not about favoritism. This is about faith and foresight that God has given him. This blessing upon these two sons of Joseph, now sons of Jacob, was fulfilled in Israel's history. These were two great tribes in Israel, yet Ephraim, the second-born, was greater. In fact, the name Ephraim was sometimes used to refer to the entire kingdom of the northern tribes of Israel. But that'll be much later in Israel's history. And in putting this blessing upon Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob used this phrase, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day. Jacob's testimony was a testimony of grace. Jacob didn't say how faithful he was to God. No, he remarked about how faithful God had been to him. And this phrase, the God who has fed me, could be literally translated, the God who has shepherded me. This is the first mention in the Bible of God being a shepherd to his people. And he refers to it here. And with Jacob being the man he was, often straying, he was a straying sheep, prone to wander, yet God was still a faithful shepherd to Jacob. And we see this culminating in his ability to pass on the blessing to his grandsons here in chapter 48, and he will also do the same with his own sons in chapter 49. Continuing now, verse 17. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Now Joseph, he's surprised. He's a little upset when Jacob crosses his hands to bless Ephraim over Manasseh. But he had intentionally positioned them for the older to receive the right hand of blessing. Yet Israel deliberately crossed his arms because he prophetically understood that Ephraim would be greater than the firstborn. I find it fascinating that later in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah 31, verse 9, for I am a father, this is prophetic, for I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. In calling Ephraim his firstborn, he is referring to it as a position. And this shows us how the idea of firstborn in the Bible is often a position of prominence, not necessarily meaning first out of the womb. Now, this is relevant because of the person and work of Jesus Christ. In Colossians 1, verse 15, referring to Jesus, it says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Now, we understand that doesn't mean that Jesus was literally the firstborn creature of God, because Jesus was not created. Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, Jesus created all things. Therefore, he himself is not among the creation. Yet Jesus Christ has the preeminence and the exalted status that is associated with that role of firstborn. It's a position of status and exaltation. And who would know this concept better than Jacob? When he was in the womb with his twin brother Esau, and his mom was having a tough time with the pregnancy, and they took it before the Lord, and the Lord said to her, well, 2 nations are in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. The position of firstborn was promised to Jacob, not Esau. He's probably thinking back to that as he pronounces this, truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. And history bears this out. Ephraim will become a more notable group, having more land. They'll become a bigger tribe than Manasseh, and they will be in the center of the nation, as was prophesied. So we've seen the passing on of the inheritance, passing on of the blessing. Now we come to the passing of the torch, verse 21. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. This is truly a passing of the torch from Israel to Joseph and to all his sons. Israel was the last of the 3 great patriarchs to pass from the scene, yet God's work did not end with him. It would go on. So Joseph here, he would receive one portion above his brothers. This refers to Joseph being the father of the 2 tribes of Israel, while his brothers each fathered 1 tribe of Israel. Now, Jacob mentions something in verse 22 that we have not been made aware of yet in the book of Genesis. It just kind of pops up on us here, where he makes mention of taking the land from the hand of the Amorite. Apparently, while he was still in Canaan, Jacob battled over control of a portion of land from the Amorites, and here he is deeding that land to Joseph and his descendants. They would take that land some 400 years later when, under the leadership of Joshua, Israel comes back into the land of Canaan to possess it. And something else that's interesting in verse 22, there seems to be a play on words because you see that word portion. In Hebrew, portion is Shechem. If that sounds familiar, Shechem means portion. Shechem became a city in Israel. And in the New Testament, Jesus, he visits a woman who is a Samaritan, the woman at the well. That story, the Samaritan woman, it says he went to this area of Shechem, to the city of Sychar, the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. That's the portion. That's the land. That's the Shechem, the portion that he gave to Joseph. But notice in this blessing that Jacob passes on to Joseph and by extension to all 12 tribes of Israel. But in verse 21, Jacob said, God will be with you. That phrase completes a wonderful work regarding Jacob's recognition of God's presence in his life. In Genesis 28, God spoke to Jacob the phrase, I am with you. And that's how God works with a young believer, maybe someone new to the faith, young in the Lord. God says, hey, I want you to know I am with you. I am present with you. I am powerful in your life. To hear that from the Lord, I mean, that's appropriate for a young believer. That's helpful for a young believer. But then in Genesis 31, Jacob heard the phrase, I will be with you. And that shows us that what God expects the growing believer to trust that God will be with them, even when they only had the promise of his presence. So it's a greater level. Hey, I am with you, but I will be with you. It draws out trust in the believer. God is saying to the growing believer, you may not feel my presence right now, but no, I will be with you. That's what the Lord spoke to Jacob in Genesis 31, verse 3. But in verse 5 of that same chapter, in Genesis 31, Jacob himself speaks and he says, God has been with me. That's maturity. That's the mark of a mature believer. As a mature believer can say how God has been with them, even when they didn't necessarily feel his presence in the way that maybe they would have preferred. And we all can experience that. We know I would have preferred to feel God's presence more in this situation, but you know what? God has been with me. So we see in Jacob's life, the Lord first says, I am with you. Then he says, I will be with you. And then the believer answers back with the testimony of, I know God has been with me. And then now, here in verse 21, Jacob says to his son Joseph, God will be with you. God gives the mature believer the opportunity to encourage others with the promise of God's presence. It's great to say, I know God. I know God's been with me. But to be able to encourage someone else, hey, God will be with you. This is Jacob finishing well. He's passing the baton to the next generation, reminding them of God's promises. Jacob ends his race with faith-filled words and forward-looking hope for his descendants. Even in exile, Jacob believed in God's promise to bring his people home into the promised land. He was walking by faith, not by sight. So Jacob isn't just tying up loose ends. He's launching a legacy. And God is calling each of us to live in such a way that our children, our families, our friends, those who we pour into spiritually, spiritual children, spiritual heirs, that we're equipping them to walk with the Lord, to walk in God's promises with greater clarity, with greater commitment, and greater courage than we do. What torch are you handing off? What are you passing on? What future are you preparing others to run toward? Are we preparing the next generation to walk in God's promises? Are we blessing them with faith, hope, trust, truth? Let's not just leave an inheritance. Let's leave a legacy. Like Jacob, may we pass on a legacy of blessing that points to the shepherd who has guided us. Let's bow our heads in prayer.